Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. Trouble is in the land, confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the star. One day a man came to Jesus. Once he wanted to trick Jesus and show him that he knew a little more than Jesus knew and throw him off base. He talked about a certain man who fell among thieves. You remember that a Levite, and the priest passed by on the other side, they didn't stop to help him. Finally, a man of another race came by. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but he got down with him, administered first aid, and helped the man in need. Jesus ended up saying this was the good man, this was the great man. You know, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. So the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That's the question before you tonight. We got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us tonight on our Engage YouTube channel. We're so glad that you chose to join us tonight. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment on how the service was, and don't forget about the Zoom meetings after the service.
Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in to today's service. You know, I want to start today's message with a confession. I love singing in my car. And I'm not talking about mumbling or humming along to a song in a socially acceptable manner. I'm talking about loud and awful singing. Raise your hand if you can relate with me. Come on, Jonathan. Thank you. Sometimes it's helpful to be reminded that we car singers aren't alone. Here's the thing though, I've noticed something when it comes to my car singing. I can sing along to an entire album without actually knowing a single lyric. I sing along to the melody and find words close enough to the lyrics that it sounds like I'm doing it right. The reason I've gotten so good at this semi-singing is because I hear without listening. I bring this up because based on what I see on social media and hear from the people around me, I think this lack of listening goes beyond song lyrics. You know, last week we started a series called More Than a Hashtag, where we began tackling the topic of racial reconciliation. We kicked it off by looking at God's grand vision for unity and reconciliation. We saw that God created all people in His image. We saw Jesus' prayer for unity. We saw a glimpse of the future glory we are heading towards. However, if we looked around, it doesn't take long to see the grand vision isn't fulfilled yet. There is still a gap to the bridge, right? But thankfully, the Bible gives us a 3-step process to move us in the right direction. Let me spell it out for you in one sentence before we dive in. Here's your main point for tonight. The process of listening, believing, and weeping is really what is going to bridge the gap between us understanding different ethnicities. This process is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump in and unpack the first part, listening. That's step 1, listen. Verses 19 and 20 of James chapter 1 gives us a great place to start. Look what James says here. My dear brothers and sisters, understand this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, and for human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. Did you catch all of that? Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Why don't we just level the playing field here before we go any further? Anybody bad at doing what James said? Is anyone slow to listen, quick to get your opinion in, and short-fused? If you're not shaking your head up and down right now, you may not be listening, which would make you guilty with the rest of us. The reality is we all struggle with obeying these verses. Why? Because the opposite of these verses comes much more naturally. And I would argue it's even more natural in this day and age because we have more ways to speak than ever. Nowadays we are quick to speak, quick to tweet, quick to text, quick to snap, and so on. I mean, these new forms of communication have made it harder to listen, and they certainly haven't made it easier to be patient or gentle. If you've been on YouTube lately, then you already understand what I'm talking about. If you want to know the depth of the sinfulness of the human heart, just read a comment thread on YouTube. It's virtually a war zone. People can be so quick to speak, quick to anger, and slow to listen. Anyone ever watch the movie Zootopia? I mean, the whole movie is fantastic, but in my opinion, there is one scene that takes the spotlight. There's a character in the movie named Flash, which is a terribly ironic name because Flash is a sloth. And we are introduced to Flash in his workplace, the DMV. You know, during the scene, the two main characters of the movie approach Flash at the DMV, and for the next 5 minutes, your entire body cringes because how slow Flash moves. Which, if we are being honest, is a fairly accurate experience at the DMV in real life. Flash talks slow, moves slow, works slow, and exists slow, if that's possible. But as cringe-worthy as this scene is, it masterfully depicts what our listening looks like at times, especially concerning the subject of racial reconciliation. In fact, I think our slowness to listen has furthered the gap between people of different ethnicities. This is a huge problem. Given what we've learned so far about God's grand vision for unity and reconciliation, I don't know if you know this, but I'm white. I'll give you a second to let that sink in. I know many of you are shocked. But because of this, my world growing up was very white as well, which meant there were things I took for granted and things I didn't understand. You see, if you are white, you don't have to consciously think about your race and how it affects your everyday life. In my case, I never had to worry about walking the neighborhood at night with my hood up. If I got pulled over, the only thing I was afraid of was getting a ticket. And I've never had to worry about how many of my friends' parents were going to view me when I spent the night for the first time. Simply put, race and racism were not on my mind. They didn't have to be because I was white. Now, I don't need to feel guilty about being white, get that. But I do need to be aware of my whiteness and the advantage that came from it. For a long time, I simply wasn't. The topic of racial reconciliation didn't break my heart until I listened to people who looked different than me. It didn't start with personal conversation at first. Rather, it happened by watching what was unfolding from the sidelines. I had many pastors and rappers of color that were my friends, and I respected them. Their theology was sound and their love for God was obvious. But their tone changed a few years ago. They began speaking up about personal prejudice, police relations, and the history of mistreatment toward people of color in our country. Through this display of vulnerability, they let people like me into their reality. As a result, my white world began to crack a little bit. I started to realize that just maybe my perspective wasn't the only perspective that was true. I mean, this is extremely important for every one of us to grasp. Our own experience isn't the standard for everyone else's experiences, right? Just because you didn't deal with this or that doesn't mean everyone who said they did is wrong. In fact, once you talk with people of color about their experiences of prejudice, you start to really hear trends that display and affirm different narratives than you may be accustomed to. You know, one common thing I hear when talking with brothers or sisters of color in some versions of this: I experience prejudice regularly in department stores and grocery stores. Oftentimes I go about my weekly shopping and I notice people following me, not because they want to help me find something, but because they want to make sure I don't steal anything. Isn't that awful? Sure, you could retort and say, well, they're just being paranoid. I have never felt like I was being followed. But if that's your response, you have already forgotten what we just talked about. This is why reconciliation must start with listening, because listening expands our perspective. However, it doesn't stop with listening. Let's move on to the second piece of this process, believing. That's step 2, believe. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Check out what Paul says in verses 6 and 7. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Paul says a lot of great things about love in this passage, and we could probably apply them to any of the issue of racial reconciliation. But I want to focus on the part that says, love believes all things. Obviously, Paul is not telling us to blindly believe everything we hear. That would be silly. There are people in this world who believe in flying spaghetti monsters. I mean, there are people in this world who have made a career of searching for the Loch Ness Monster. Although that sounds pretty awesome, it's ridiculous. Blind belief is not what Paul is championing here. Rather, he is calling us away from cynicism and suspicion towards people's stories. Belief is an important part of the process because it does no good if we listen with suspicion. In other words, if we act like we are listening to our brothers and sisters of color, but we really are just looking for plot or holes or loopholes. And I'm not saying you can't disagree, ask questions, or even have a good old-fashioned argument. Just keep in mind you may be wrong. There will be times when you need to give people the benefit of the doubt. Times when you need to challenge your own preconceived notions. Time when you need to doubt your doubts. All of these things can have a profound effect on the process of reconciliation. Here's the thing we have to prepare ourselves for. If we listen and we believe the stories of our brothers and sisters of color, our hearts will break. I think our unbelief is the reason these stories don't bother us anymore. We watch stories of prejudice and racism unfold as if they are just another movie playing on the big screen. You know, I remember when I went to see The Meg with my daughter, and you've never heard of this movie. It's about a gigantic prehistoric shark that escapes from the deepest part of the ocean back into the wild. It was an enjoyable movie, but after it was older, we were kind of disappointed because the shark didn't eat enough people. And you know what? I totally agree with that. You see, we could say those things because, you see, it was a movie. And because it was a movie and it wasn't real. Now, if we were to look at that and say it was a real shark attack in California and it was real, if we responded that way, we would be psychopaths. However, in the case of racism in our country, it is very real. And if it is real, your eyes may get a little wet, your heart may get a little heavy. See, we have to listen. We have to believe. And if this is really happening, we have to weep. This brings us to our final part of the process, weeping. And I must tell you, my daughter is weeping over the things happening in our nation when it comes to racism. Step 3 is weep. Look what Paul says in Romans 12:15. He says this in Romans 12:15. Check it out, get your Bibles. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. One thing we often miss about this subject, it is that it is not solely an intellectual one. Though knowledge is extremely important to a right understanding of racism and reconciliation, the buck doesn't stop there. When we discuss the pain of racism and the goal of reconciliation, we must remember we are talking about real people who have shed real tears over real tragedies. Our willingness to come to terms with and embrace this is summed up in one simple word: empathy. You know, Merriam-Webster defines empathy as the action of understanding, being aware of or being sensitive to and vicaciously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another. I wonder what would happen if we all started practicing that. How could our world change? Granted, I am very aware that I can't fully step into the shoes of a person of color. I have never lived their life and I never will. However, I can do my best to have empathy and weep with those who weep. But let's be honest, empathy isn't easy. We can be very bad at handling people's emotional wounds. Think of this contrast for a moment. When someone breaks a bone, we don't say, well, if you would just stop focusing on it, it would stop hurting. Or, I don't really believe that it's broken. I think you're exaggerating. These responses would be hurtful and unhelpful. Yet when someone expresses deep emotional pain, especially over race-related issues, we tend to handle it just like that. In fact, I think there are a few common mistakes we make in our response to race-related hurt. A few responses that would probably better be replaced with weeping. Here's the first response. We put facts over feelings. This may strike you as strange. I mean, how is that a bad response? After all, that's good advice in a lot of areas of life. However, in this case, it can be damaging because it can come across as hard-hearted or apathetic. When we start talking about racism and begin listening to people's stories, a lot of us turn into the modern-day Sherlock Holmes. We listen closely, not necessarily because we want to understand, but because we want to investigate every detail. We start looking at all these things to find ammo. Well, if you think about it logically, you don't really have a reason to be upset. Let me explain with the 19 bullet points I have crafted in my mind while you were talking. Here's the problem with that. When someone is in pain and their heart is heavy, they're not taking time to create pie charts and graphs to analyze everything. During these times, people don't need a fact checker, they need a friend. We must let people feel. Don't correct, disapprove, or belittle. Just weep. Here's a second common response that would be better replaced with weeping. We make unhelpful comparisons. You know, race-related pain is a deep tissue issue. I mean, has anyone ever had a professional massage before? If so, then like me, realize rather than quickly how strange it is to feel so good and so close to death at the same time. I mean, it feels good because the relief from working out all of the knots that have been left alone for so long is glorious. However, because those knots have been untouched for so long, it also hurts like heck. The knots of racism in our country are very similar. As unpopular as it is to admit, racism has been a reality in our country since its founding. By God's grace, we are healing, but we still have a long way to go. Because of this, there simply aren't a lot of things to compare to. So when a person of color shares their pain with us, the last thing we should say is, I completely understand. Someone judged me for wearing skinny jeans once. Or how about this one? Hey, I get it. I have blonde hair. Have you heard how many blonde jokes there are? Those simply aren't helpful comparisons. Obviously, I'm not trying to belittle anyone's pain here, but there is a difference between my skinny jeans story and someone's experience with racism. Here's a third common response that would better be replaced with weeping. We treat people like pity projects. Weeping with our brothers and sisters of color doesn't mean swooping in as their saviors. There is one savior, and he ain't us. We aren't counselors, and people of color aren't patients. They are our friends, they are our family. People aren't projects, and support means more than sympathy. We need some action steps. So we know the process of listening, believing, and weeping is key to bridging the gap between people of different ethnicities. But we still are left with how to initiate the process. Thankfully, there are 2 action steps that you can take this very week to move out and begin to see some reconciliation happen. The first action step is read. I know you guys aren't so fond of that, but here's the truth. Whether you agree or not, good books have been some of the most helpful tools in my tool belt. They gave me the opportunity to listen, believe, and weep. Before I had strong relationships with people of color, I could do so within person. And after I had suggest one book, if I could just suggest one book, I would suggest this, One Blood by John M. Perkins. Write that down, order it ASAP. But here's the second step, befriending. That's the second action step, befriend. At some point, you'll have to get your head out of the books and into real life. I encourage you to find someone of a different ethnicity you click with and begin a friendship. Over time, learn their stories, and when comfortable, ask about how race affected their story. You might be surprised how refreshing this is for both of you. Because I truly believe as we begin to listen, as we begin to believe, and as we begin to weep, things will begin to change. So listen, I know the prospect of reconciliation could look daunting, but if we start here with the 3-step process and initiate this through paper or personally, we can begin to be a part of fulfilling God's grand vision for unity and reconciliation. Because truly, that's what God is looking for. You know, I know this has been some really deep stuff these last couple of weeks, but it is something that we need to discuss. And what a greater place we need to discuss it but at church, right? We need to tackle the hard subjects. And I pray that you would take this into your spirit. You would take this into your heart. You would begin and go get some of those books, begin to read, begin to ask questions, get into groups and begin to discuss these things. Because as you do, I truly believe that God will change your heart. Because I heard it all day. I even heard the family of George Floyd say, you know, love, love, love. We need love to come. Well, you know what? God is love. And if we want love to change everything, then we need God. You have the answer as Christians. Young people, you have the answer. The answer is Jesus Christ. The love of Christ. As you begin to show that love and you begin to introduce other people to that love and they begin to know Jesus, that's when the world will change. That's when total reconciliation will happen. But for now, you and I, we need to do something. We need to do our part. We need to walk in mercy and walk humbly before God. Love mercy and walk humbly, because we really want to see a difference. And that's what God wants us to do. So God bless you. We'll see you next week. Don't remember, find somebody this week and ask them some hard questions that maybe you want to be answered. Parents, get with your children and speak with them about this. Because I truly believe that this is the time and the age where the church needs to step up instead of backing away. God bless. We'll see you next Wednesday.